I've worked the night shift at the ER for about 5 years now. It's mostly routine, registering patients, coordinating with nurses, and dealing with the occasional late-night rush. Things slow down around 3 a.m. when even the city seems to be asleep. That's when the weirdest things happen. One night I was covering reception mostly alone as the nurses moved in and out of the station. It was a slow shift. Only a couple of patients waiting, an elderly woman with a sprained wrist, a guy who got into a bar fight, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 3:15 a.m., I looked up from my monitor and saw her. A woman sitting in the waiting area, her back hunched, her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing a pale blue hospital gown, one of ours, but I didn't remember seeing her come in. I had been talking to a patient, a drunk guy who was slurring his words and needed help filling out his paperwork, so maybe I had missed her arrival. But when I checked the log, she wasn't on it. No one had called her name. She was just there. She looked sick. Her skin was sallow, almost gray, and she had deep shadows under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. Her dark hair hung limply around her face, but what struck me most was how still she was. She didn't fidget, didn't check her phone. She just sat, staring at the floor. I glanced over at the triage nurse, Karen, who had been flipping through a chart. "Hey, did you check in that woman?" I asked. Karen looked up, confused. "Who?" I turned back to the waiting area, ready to point her out, but the seat was empty. My stomach dropped. She couldn't have just walked out, not without me hearing the door or seeing movement. The security doors only open when buzzed from the desk, and I hadn't hit the button. I shook it off. Maybe I'd been staring at the screen too long. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was late, after all. About an hour later I went to grab a coffee from the vending machine near the entrance. As I passed by the waiting area, I felt it again, that weird sense of stillness. And there she was, same seat, same pale blue gown, staring at the floor. This time I didn't look away. "Ma'am," I called, no reaction. I stepped closer. "Are you waiting for someone?" She lifted her head, just slightly. That's when I noticed something strange. She was sitting so still it felt unnatural, like someone holding their breath on purpose. I backed away and walked briskly to the nurse's station. Karen was still there, this time logging vitals into the system. "There's a woman in the waiting room," I said, keeping my voice low. "She's not checked in, but she's wearing a hospital gown. I think she might have wandered down from a room." Karen frowned. "Where?" I turned and pointed. "Empty." Now I felt like I was losing it. Karen gave me a tired look. "You need a break." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just overtired, seeing shadows where there weren't any. I took my coffee and went back to the desk, forcing myself to focus on paperwork. Around 5 a.m., after coming back from a quick bathroom break, I checked the security footage, just to be sure. I pulled up the waiting room feed from earlier. The timestamp showed 3:15 a.m. The camera angle faced the chairs. I pressed play. The waiting room was empty. My pulse sped up. I scrubbed through the footage, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The entire time from when I had first seen her to when I got up to get coffee, the waiting room had been empty. But just as I was about to turn off the feed, I saw something. The chair she had been sitting in moved. Not much, just a slight shift, like someone had just stood up. The footage flickered, and for a brief second, it looked like something was beginning to take shape near the chair. I panicked and closed the program before I could see any more. A chill ran down my spine as I watched. If I saw something undeniable, something I couldn't explain, I'd never be able to unsee it. The next morning, I told one of the older nurses about what happened. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she nodded and said, "A woman died in the ER last year around 3 a.m. She was wearing a blue gown when they brought her in." Since that night, I avoid thinking about it too much. I tell myself it's easier not to know that some things are better left unexplored. But deep down, I know better. Maybe that's why I never went back to rewatch the footage. I've worked as a night shift nurse for 6 years. It's not an easy job. Long hours, understaffed nights, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones. Hospitals at night aren't like what people think. There's no constant rush, no bustling energy, just dimly lit hallways, the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional distant sound of a patient groaning in their sleep. It's quiet. Too quiet. You learn things working the night shift, the way some rooms seem colder than others, even when the temperature settings are the same, the way seasoned nurses don't like talking about certain places in the hospital, as if acknowledging something might make it worse. You start to notice patterns, how some nights are just another shift, quiet and uneventful, while others carry a weight you can't quite explain, like everyone is waiting for something to happen. Even understanding this, what happened next was something I still can't explain. The night had been quiet, the kind where the minutes drag, and you almost forget you're in a place where life and death cross paths constantly. I had just finished checking vitals on a patient down the hall when the call came in. Patient in room 312 had gone into cardiac arrest. My colleague Sarah and I rushed in to assist the code team. It was a long attempt, nearly 45 minutes of compressions, adrenaline shots, the defibrillator, but nothing worked. The patient was gone. The doctor called it at 4:14 a.m., time of death recorded. We cleaned the body, tagged the toe, and placed a sheet over his face, standard procedure. The body transport team was on their way to take him down to the morgue, but they were backed up, so we were stuck waiting. Sarah and I stayed for a moment after, looking at each other as the weight of the past 45 minutes sank in. Neither of us spoke right away. You never really get used to it, even when you think you have. "That sucked," Sarah finally muttered, rubbing her eyes. 45 minutes, we really tried. "Yeah," I sighed. "Still doesn't feel real." She shook her head. "Nope." That's when we heard it. Beep. It was faint, but unmistakable. We both turned toward the room. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. I nodded slowly. "Yeah." Another beep. We exchanged uneasy looks before stepping back inside. The heart monitor was still attached to the patient. Beep. My stomach dropped. That was impossible. I stared at the screen. The monitor showed an erratic heartbeat, weak but present. "No way," Sarah whispered. That has to be a glitch, right?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know." We lifted the sheet. The patient's face was pale, his eyes slightly open but unfocused. His body was stiff, cold, dead, and yet the monitor kept beeping. I pressed my fingers to his wrist, his neck. No pulse. I grabbed my stethoscope, pressed it against his chest. Silence. No heartbeat. "The hell is going on?" Sarah's voice wavered. I didn't have an answer, but something was wrong. I yanked off the electrodes. The screen should have flatlined immediately. It didn't. Instead, the beeping continued, erratic, scattered, a weak flickering heartbeat that didn't belong to the body in front of me. Sarah muttered a curse and yanked the plug from the wall. The screen went black. For a second, the room was silent. Then a sound broke the stillness, the kind you hear right before someone dies. We both froze. My heart was hammering in my chest. Sarah took a step back. "No, no. The patient's mouth was slightly open, but no air came out. His chest didn't move. It was just a sound, a hollow deathbed breath that had no right existing in a body that no longer functioned. We stood there, paralyzed, until the transport team arrived. We didn't tell them what happened. What were we supposed to say, that a dead man took one last breath for no reason? They took him to the morgue. Sarah and I finished our shift in silence. The next day I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a mechanical error, a delay in the system. But that didn't explain the sound, the way the breath felt, the way my stomach churned just thinking about it. Until this day, I try to convince myself there was a rational reason for what happened. Wires crossing, delayed readings, exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, but the part of me that stood in that room knows the dead don't breathe. If you're still here, you've been marked. The only way to stay safe? Stick with us. Subscribe before it's too late. And if you have a horror story of your own, something real, something you can't explain, tell us in the comments or send us an email. We're always watching.